This is picking up that thread a little bit, but one of the interesting things you touched on in the book is the first couple attempts at monotheism. They didn't go too well.
Yeah. No, it's I was talking about sort of the hundreds of thousands of years in which there can be such a thing as the religious impulse. Of those hundreds of thousands of years, the idea of one God is, as I was just mentioning a little bit earlier, barely 3,000 years old. And even then, it didn't work. The ancient mind was incapable of conceiving of the notion that there could be one God who was responsible for both good and evil, darkness and light, the earth and the sky.
It is astonishing that in the hundreds of thousands of years in which humanity's religious impulse has expressed itself through belief in the soul, the worship of ancestors, the creation of spirits, the formation of gods and pantheons, the construction of temples and shrines, and the establishment of myths and rituals, what we today recognize as monotheism, that is, belief in a sole, singular God, has existed for barely 3,000 of those years. It is not that monotheistic systems didn't sporadically arise throughout the history of religions. The movements of Akhenaten and Zarathustra are proof that they did. It's just that when they did arise, they were routinely rejected and denied, sometimes violently so. What was it that kept monotheism at bay for so much of religious history? Partly, it has to do with its exclusivist connotations. Monotheism, it must be understood, is not defined as the sole worship of one God. That is called monolatry, and it is a fairly common phenomenon in the history of religions. Monotheism means the sole worship of one God and the negation of all other gods. It requires one to believe that all other gods are false. And if all other gods are false, any truth based on belief in those gods is also false. Indeed, monotheism rejects the very possibility of subjective truth, which explains why, as we saw with Akhenaten, monotheistic systems must often be brutally enforced in order to overcome people's natural beliefs and assumptions. To accept the proposition of a sole singular God without human form, attributes, or qualities would require either an enormous cognitive effort on the part of the worshipper or a profound disruption in a religious community's spiritual evolution. Indeed, the story of how monotheism, after centuries of failure and rejection, finally and permanently took root in human spirituality, begins with the story of how the God of Abraham, El, and the God of Moses, Yahweh, gradually merged to become the sole singular deity that we now know as God.
So what did the priests of Baal do? Why do they keep, the heavy stuff keeps coming down on them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny because I think those of us who do read the Hebrew scriptures do so in English. And in English, the different gods that the Israelites worshipped, because they worshipped different gods, are all translated into English as either God or Lord God. But if you read them in Hebrew, you would see that these are two different names for two different gods. The God of Moses is called Yahweh. The God of Abraham is called El, or Elohim. The God of Abraham is a Canaanite deity, one of the most important deities in the history of religions, the high god of Canaan, which makes sense since Abraham lived most of his life in the land of Canaan, so clearly he worshipped the Canaanite god. Yahweh, as the best that we can tell, is a Midianite deity. The Midianites were a Semitic tribe in the Sinai, part of, under sort of the umbrella of Egypt.
The God who would come to be known as Yahweh made his first appearance in the form of a burning bush, somewhere perhaps in the rocky deserts of northeastern Sinai. "This is my name forever," Yahweh tells the prophet Moses, "and this is how I will be remembered from generation to generation. Thus will you say to the children of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you." Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. This claim would have come as something of a surprise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because the fact of the matter is that these biblical patriarchs did not worship a Midianite desert deity called Yahweh. They worshipped an altogether different god, a Canaanite deity they knew as El. Scholars have known for centuries that there were two distinct deities worshipped by the Israelites in the Bible, each with a different name, different origins, and different traits. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is actually a composite work stitched together from various sources spanning a period of hundreds of years. Look closely and you can occasionally see the seams where 2 or more different traditions were sewn together. There are, for instance, 2 separate creation stories written by 2 different hands. Genesis chapter 1, in which man and woman are created together and simultaneously, and Genesis chapter 2, the much more popular Adam and Eve story, in which Eve is made from Adam's rib. There are also 2 different flood narratives, though, unlike the 2 creation stories, these are woven together to create a single conflicting account, in which the flood lasts either 40 days, Genesis 7:17, or 150 days, Genesis 7:24. The animals are brought aboard the ark in either 7 pairs of male and female, Genesis 7:2, or just 1 pair of every kind, Genesis 6:19. And the flood begins either 7 days after Noah enters the ark, Genesis 7:10, or immediately after he boards with his kin, Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 to 13. By meticulously tracing each of these separate narrative threads, biblical scholars have managed to identify at least 4 different written sources that make up the bulk of the early books of the Bible. These are named the Yahwist, or J source, J is pronounced as Y in German, which dates to the 10th or 9th century BCE and runs through large parts of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers. The Elohist, or E source, which dates to the 8th or 7th centuries BCE and is mostly confined to Genesis and parts of Exodus. The Priestly, or P source, which was written either during or immediately after the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE and is primarily a reworking of the J and E material. And finally, the Deuteronomist, or D source, which runs from the book of Deuteronomy through 1st and 2nd Kings and can be dated to somewhere between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE. There are numerous differences between these sources. For example, the Elohist material, which was probably written by a priest from northern Israel, refers to Mount Sinai as Mount Horeb and calls the Canaanites Amorites. In these passages, God tends to reveal himself mostly in visions and dreams, as opposed to the more southern-centered Yahwist material, which often portrays God in uncannily anthropomorphic ways. For instance, he creates the world through trial and error, forgetting to craft a mate for Adam. He strolls through the Garden of Eden, enjoying the evening breeze, and at one point he loses track of his creation, Adam and Eve, unable to find them when they hide among the trees. "Where are you?" Yahweh shouts into the night air. However, the primary difference between the Yahwist and the Elohist sources in the Pentateuch is that God is called by a different name in each. The God of the Elohist is El, or Elohim, the plural form of El, which is rendered in most English translations of the Bible as God, with a capital G. After these things, God, Elohim, tested Abraham. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. In contrast, the God of the Yahwist tradition is known as Yahweh, usually rendered in English Bibles as the Lord, spelled with all capital letters. The Lord, Yahweh, said, "Surely I have seen the misery of my people who are in Egypt." Exodus chapter 3, verse 7. The much later priestly source tends to go back and forth between using the names Yahweh and Elohim in an obvious attempt to merge these 2 different gods into one. Although the Yahwist material is about 100 years older than the Elohist tradition represents the older deity. In fact, while we know next to nothing about the origins of Yahweh, save that he was likely a Midianite god, El is one of the best known and most well-documented deities in the ancient Near East. a mild, distant, fatherly deity traditionally depicted either as a bearded king or in the form of a bull or calf, El was the high god of Canaan. Known as the creator of created things and the ancient of days, El also functioned as one of Canaan's chief fertility gods. But El's primary role was as the celestial king who served as father and preserver of the earthly kings of Canaan. Seated on his heavenly throne, El presided over a divine council of Canaanite gods that included Asherah, the mother goddess and El's consort, Baal, the young storm god known as the rider of the clouds, Anat, the warrior deity, Astarte, also called Ishtar, and a host of other lower deities. El was also unquestionably the original god of Israel. Indeed, the very word Israel means El perseveres.